So is anybody going to replace Jeff Larson? Or
The exact position, no, but
You're looking at these.
Hello, welcome. My name is Carol Reveld, and I've been appointed by the Commission to facilitate this technical conference. And the technical conference is in docket 19-035-42, application of Rocky Mountain Power for approval of the 2020 Inter-Jurisdictional Cost Allocation Agreement. And with that, I think we should go around the room with introductions, and then we'll turn it over to Rocky Mountain Power.
Certainly. I'm Justin Jetter, with the Utah Attorney General's Office, and I represent the Utah Division of Public Utilities.
Cheryl Murray with the Office of Consumer Services.
Sophie Hayes with Western Resource Advocates.
Mike Wilding with Rocky Mountain Power.
Steve McDougal, Pacific Corp.
Janet?
Jana Saba, Rocky Mountain Power.
Daniel Solander, Rocky Mountain Power.
Marcus Arroyo, Public Service Commission.
Joseph Hallowell with the Division of Public Utilities.
Jordan White with the Commission.
Philip Russell with Utah Association of Energy Users.
Brenda Salter with the Division.
Doug Wheelwright with the Division.
Jeff Einfeld with the Division.
Gary Smith with the Division.
Alex Ware with the Consumer Services.
Great, and I will pass around a sign-in sheet. If you'd sign it, that would be great. And we've got one more.
Artie?
Artie. And then we'll turn it over to Rocky Mountain Power.
Okay. Great. Well, thank you for this opportunity to come and to just provide an overview of the 2020 protocol, which, as noted, we filed earlier this year, late last year. And as you know, the 2020 protocol, that is an agreement amongst parties. We had around 35 organizations participate from all 6 of our service territories to discuss the interjurisdictional cost allocations between those 6 service territories. It was a process. It was a long process. It took about 3 years to get to this agreement. And over the 3-year period, we discussed lots of different topics and lots of different scenarios and worked through. One of the first things we looked at was restructuring Pacific Corp through a legal separation, having 2 companies, Rocky Mountain Power and Pacific Power, so separating the 2 brands that we operate today into 2 legal entities. As we looked through that, we determined that was cost prohibitive and would not be in the best interest of our customers. We also looked at what we started out as the CLEAR proposal, which was Coal Life Evaluation and Reassignment is what that stood for, and that was a one-time reassignment of all coal generation resources. So as some of you are probably aware, Oregon has a law, a newly passed law within the last couple of years that says that coal has to be out of their electric rates by the end of 2029. So to facilitate compliance with that law, one of the things that we had looked at was doing a one-time reassignment of coal plants. And then we also looked at maybe a limited reassignment, something a little bit smaller than that. Neither of those proposals really took hold. We talked about them for a long time, but I said just was too soon, and neither of those proposals were in the best interest of all the parties involved and all of our customers. We also looked at alternative approaches that were proposed by certain parties at the table, including a concept of like a green tariff where the Rocky Mountain Power side of our system would serve the Pacific Power side on kind of a green tariff type approach, or just an east, and that would include all coal resources being assigned to the RMP states. And then again, that really was determined not to be in the best interest of our customers. And we performed various sensitivity analysis around all of these. And really where we landed was a phased-in approach that would reassign existing generation resources as the states that needed to be out of those resources came to the end of their lives, to the end of their depreciable lives. And so during the process, Oregon had passed the Senate Bill 1547 that we talked about, or Oregon had passed that before, and then during the process, Washington passed a law that that requires coal to be out of Washington electric rates by the end of 2025. So those were two things that we were dealing with. Also, but really the core principles that drove these discussions over the last couple of years is providing states the flexibility to comply with their own energy policy and their own energy needs, but also keep the system together, and so we can continue to benefit from the system as a whole. And so that's how we got to the 2020 protocol, which we said is more of a phased-in approach, and we'll talk about that. A couple of the highlights about the 2020 protocol. We did reach a memo of understanding on the development of a nodal pricing model, and we'll discuss more about the nodal pricing model as we go in. But this is an approach, and where as the states are diverging, their resource portfolios are diverging and becoming unique to each state, the nodal pricing model will help facilitate the allocations for the net power costs and allow us to continue to operate as a single system. The current, the 2020 protocol essentially extends the 2017 protocol for California, Oregon, Idaho, Utah, and Wyoming, which the 2017 protocol expired 12/31/2019, and so this 2020 protocol is effective for the periods of 1/1/20 to 12/31/23. So again, limited time and duration, and the 2017 protocol is essentially extended, but with a few modifications that we'll discuss. And then for Washington, they use their own allocation methodology. They called the West Control Area Allocation Methodology, or the WCA. So again, that the 2020 protocol extends that, but with some much more material modifications to that bring them closer to the system approach. And the hope there is to continue to work with Washington and for them to continue to be involved in the process and move them to a full participant in the next agreement, the next protocol after the 2020 protocol expires. The 2020 protocol, it does set out a process to resolve some remaining issues, and it also sets out some issues that we've agreed on that will need to change in the next agreement. And part of the 2020 protocol is that it does have to be agreed upon, or it has been agreed upon by, more than 20 stakeholders and participants throughout our 6 territories. We have representatives in all 6 of our states that have signed the 2020 protocol, and it does need to be agreed to or approved by the commissions. And if it's not approved by the commissions, then there's processes in place where we would regroup as the MSP group to discuss that and see if any modifications were made were material and if further discussions need to be had. So we've talked about the time period. There's really 2 time periods laid out in the 2020 protocol. Moving on to slide 4. The first time period is the interim period, and that's the effective period of the 2020 protocol from 1/1/20 to 12/31/23. And then there's the post-interim period, and that begins at the expiration of the 2020 protocol. So the 2020 protocol lays out a framework for discussions and continued negotiations for that next interjurisdictional allocation methodology. And then it's really broken into the 2020 protocol, and we're going to delve into each of these deeper as we go through the slides. But it's really broken into 3 groups of issues. There's the implemented issues, and these are resolutions to certain issues that take effect immediately with the 2020 protocol, and they are effective during the interim period. There's resolved issues, so these are issues that parties have agreed to would be effective in the next agreement in the post-interim period, and those have been discussed and negotiated, and parties agree that they're necessary in the next phase. And then the framework issues, these are the issues that we've identified that still need some considerable work and discussions and negotiations with parties, and those over the next 3 years will be worked on by the framework issues work group, and we'll talk more about that. And then one thing to note is the resolved issues will only be implemented in the post-interim period if the framework issues are resolved and if we come to an agreement on the framework issues. So moving on to slide 5, we have filed the 2020 protocol in Idaho, Oregon, Utah, and Wyoming. I think all states are kind of similarly situated in their process right now. States are in the kind of about the same pattern as Utah. It's been filed. We've had discussions. We just had a workshop like this in Wyoming a couple weeks ago, and Oregon is the first one up that we would expect an order from, and that's because we're filing a rate case in February 14th in Oregon, and so we asked for an expedited case proceeding there so that we would have approval of the 2020 protocol in time to file our rate case. In Washington, the cost allocation methodology had to be filed as part of a rate case. We filed that rate case in December, and so that is consolidated into the rate case and will be handled through that proceeding. And then California, approval will be sought in a future rate case, and that's the standard in California as well, that we have to seek that through the rate case. And so California, we are on a 3-year rate case cycle, so I think 2 years we'll be filing a rate case if we follow the schedule they set out for us. And now the 2020 protocol would be part of that rate case. And like I said, we have approximately 22 signatories to the 2020 protocol to date.
Hey, Mike?
Yeah.
In Washington, are you actually seeking approval of the 2020 protocol agreement, or are you seeking approval of the, sort of the Washington, the white?
The YJAM is what we call it, the Washington Inter-Jurisdictional Allocation Methodology, yeah. We are seeking approval of both,
Okay.
essentially, yeah.
Okay.
And the YJAM is the MOU for the, that modifies the WCA, and that really is the cost allocation methodology for Washington that, like I said, kind of starts that transition to full system. But we did want them to approve the 2020 protocol for, things that we pointed out that, there's going to be further discussions and negotiations around those framework issues.
Right, so, and that was included as one of the attachments in the
Yeah.
2020 protocol.
So you can see here, I won't go through all of the appendices, but you can see that there are 7 appendices to the 2020 protocol, and they're all listed here. And then the protocol, there's 3 witnesses on the Rocky Mountain Power side. There's policy and development of the 2020 protocol was sponsored by Joelle, and on the Pacific Power side, her counterpart at Allocation. Steve McDougall sponsored testimony on the revenue requirement issues, and I sponsored testimony on the net power cost issues and the nodal pricing MOU and the YJAM or the Washington MOU. So moving on to slide 7. And I should say, yeah, feel free to stop me at any time if you have any questions. I know there are some folks that were, heavily involved in the negotiation process and lived the MSP over the last 3 years and even before that. But I know there's also folks that are might be hearing this for the first time, so please feel free to stop me if you have any questions or if we're moving too fast. So moving on to slide 7. So we talked about the interim period expires 12/31/23. However, if we are able to resolve the framework issues before that and before 12/31/22, we can ask that the interim period end on 12/31/22, and we move into the next phase of the post-interim period methodology. New resources that are in service prior to the end of the interim period are considered existing resources and will continue to be system allocated. And if the interim period does end in 22, Pacific Power would propose that any of the new generation resources that were identified in the 2019 IRP that were planned to be in service by the end of 23 would continue to be system allocated. I'll get a little bit about the WCA methodology or the YJAM, the changes to the WCA. There are a few, the big changes are we moved to a system allocation method, so they are recognizing the PAC East Balancing Area Authority and both the generation and the transmission assets that are included there. They will now be allocated a system generation allocation factor of transmission, but they will transition into that over 3 years. So that's the incremental change for them is about $9 million. So it'll be approximately a $3 million adder each year over the next 3 years for them to move to system transmission. They will be allocated a system allocation of non-emitting generation resources. And and I should go back to that transmission. So that is existing transmission. So in the YJAM, new transmission is defined as anything coming online after 1/1/20. So the transmission included in our EV 2020 project, that will be system allocated, 100% system allocated to Washington. And we've, all parties in Washington, or not, maybe not all parties, but Washington staff, the public counsel, the consumer advocate in Washington, and the Packaging Corporation of America, who's our largest industrial customer in Washington, they have all signed on to the Washington MOU. And so any new transmission, they will be system allocated, and then existing transmission, they transition into system allocation over 3 years. It's a flash cut on the non-emitting generation resources. So with this rate case, we allocated a system allocation of all non-emitting resources to Washington, but they continue to only pay for the coal and gas resources that were included in the WCA at the higher WCA allocation, so about 22% of those.
On the new transmission,
Mhm.
after 2031, 2019, system allocation only if it's used and useful to Washington customers?
All transmission.
Yeah, that's all transmission.
Okay, so it's used and that's,
Well, they, as part of the agreement, they agreed
Yeah.
that it's used and useful in
Okay.
Washington.
Yeah,
okay.
and that is their law.
Their new definition of useful and useful
Yeah.
to Washington.
And then for the other 5 states, like I said, the 2017 protocol, moving on to slide 8, is essentially extended. We said, you'll see it says California approval pending. We filed a rate case about 2 years ago now in California. And again, California has to do the inter-jurisdictional allocation methodology in the rate case. And so that was the first time we had included the 2017 protocol in California rates. We have a proposed decision where they have accepted the 2017 protocol, but we're waiting for a final decision, which should be 1st of February. I think February 6th is the target date for that. And so that 2017 protocol will be extended in all 5 of the states. There are some changes that were agreed to. First, the equalization adjustment terminates with the 2017 protocol. So this change is a reduction of about $9 million a year to Pacific Corp's revenue requirement. And so Pacific Corp absorbs that $9 million. And then we also changed the embedded cost differential. Idaho, it continues through the end of the interim periods, and that's about a little under $1 million a year cost to customer. Oregon actually has a dynamic ECD that was capped at $10.5 million in the 2017 protocol. That will be capped now at $11 million, so that's a benefit to Oregon customers. The fixed ECD and equalization adjustments for California were netted to 0 in the 2017 protocol, and those will continue and to have no impact on California. And the Wyoming ECD ends on 12/31/2020, and then Utah does not have an ECD adjustment. So I think the net impact to Utah was ending the equalization adjustment was about $4 million for Utah, benefit to customers. So moving to the implemented issues. So these, as we pointed out, we have these 2 laws in 2 of our states that require coal to be removed from electric rates by a date certain. And so we've come up with a process in which we can handle that exit from coal plants. And for states to decide when they want to exclude the cost and benefits from their retail rates. And the process is to establish an exit date and an exit order. So the exit date, and on slide 10 here, we have the definitions of those. So the exit date is really the last date that the costs and benefits of that coal-fueled resource will be included in the rates of that state. And so to establish an exit date, we are asking for an exit order. So that would be the commission's approval of that exit date. And we are asking in the 2020 protocol that the exit order is at least 4 years before the exit date to give adequate time to go through the reassignment process. And then one important note is exit dates are only required for states, that's a state-specific decision to exit a coal plant to no longer receive the cost and benefits, or to include the costs and benefits in their rates. But Pacific Corp's economic decision to close a coal plant earlier than anticipated, that does not require an exit order. So there's no change to that normal process that Pacific Corp would go through for that. So once an exit order is established, or an exit date is established through an exit order, there is a reassignment process by which it can be, Pacific Corp can propose that the other states who have not exited the coal plant or established an exit date can take a reassignment, take an incremental reassignment of that coal plant above what they are already assigned. The decommissioning costs, so there's a process to ensure that we accrue adequate decommissioning costs that for the states that exit those coal plants, so that when they exit, they have paid their fair share of those decommissioning costs. And then the last implemented issue and the last change is that beginning with new PPAs on 1/1/20, so these are PPAs, or QF PPAs that are fully executed or have a LEO after 1/1/20. Those will now be situs assigned instead of system allocated, and we'll go into how that works in a little bit. But anything that was any QF that was fully executed or had a LEO before 12/31/19, so it doesn't have to be online, it just has to have an executed contract or a legally enforceable obligation, that will continue to be system allocated as it is under the 2017 protocol. So moving on to slide 11, we'll dive into each of these a little bit more, and we talked a lot of, we kind of really hit the high points of what an exit date and exit order are. There's kind of 4 groups of coal-fired resources that we've grouped together in the 2020 protocol. There's Group A here. These are the resources that we have proposed common depreciable lives in all states, and that we expect will close at the same time for all states. So that's Choya Unit 4, and we recently announced that at the end of this year we will be closing or retiring that plant. Craig's Units 1 and 2, Colstrip's Unit 3 and 4. Part of the MOU, Colstrip 4 and Jim Bridger are both agreed to be depreciated with a 2023 life in Washington, which is a little before their end of life that's required by law, but we'll talk more about that and why that is. And then we have this group of coal resources that Oregon, that we've asked and that we will ask in the rate case for Oregon to the commission there to issue an exit order for these group of resources that are before 2027, and those are the Jim Bridger units 1 through 4, all 4 Dave Johnson units, and both Naughton units. And so the other states besides Oregon and Washington have depreciable lives that extend beyond 2027, and so we'll talk more about what happens there with the reassignment process or potential reassignment in that process. And then the second or the third tranche is that Group C. So these are Oregon exit dates where we would ask the Oregon Commission to provide an exit order for these plants with a date between 27 and 29, and those are the Hunter units, the Huntington units, and Wyandotte. And then we have kind of last last group hanging out here is Hayden Units 1 and 2. That's a joint owned plant in Colorado that we own a minority share of. And as part of the 2020 protocol, we will come next year, I believe, in 2021, February, with a proposal to the Framework Issues Work Group to how we would handle the Hayden Units 1 and 2, but we still have some issues that we need to work through with the other owners of that plant.
Can you remind me what the common depreciable life of Choya is?
In the depreciation study?
It was common in the depreciation study. It was supposed to close in April of 2023.
I
think it was 23.
And you haven't proposed to accelerate that?
No, we will be proposing the cost recovery in the rate case.
Yeah.
Okay,
It's 2023.
okay.
January 1 and 23 is the closure date in the agreement.
Yeah, that's in the agreement in the depreciation study. A little bit.
A little bit later.
So, okay.
So moving on to slide 12. So after we receive an exit order from a state with a date certain in which they will be removing the costs and benefits of those coal plants from their electric rates, the remaining states that have depreciable lives longer than those exit dates, we will kick off a process called the reassignment process, which will give those states the opportunity to continue to use that plant and take that incremental share of that unallocated portion of the plant. So those filings will include the economic analysis of the continued operation of the resource and a range of potential reassignments. So Oregon is about 25% of our system allocation. So if they were to exit a coal plant that was going to continue to run, there would be a 25% share that could be reassigned. So in that reassignment filing, we would file with Utah, Idaho, Wyoming, and there would be this economic analysis similar to like an IRP type of analysis that would say, the continued operations of the resource are in the benefit of the customers, and we think, and would have a range of what the potential incremental reassignment of that resource could be to Utah. We haven't talked about the Washington limited realignment, but we will talk more about that. But as we said, Washington has to be out of the coal plants by 2025. We would use limited realignment, so a similar type of proposal that we had started out with, where we reassign coal resources. We would look to reassign Washington's share of coal resources through a limited realignment. But that is a framework issue, and we'll talk more about that in the framework section. And then if the states where we do the reassignment process, if they do not collectively agree to 100% of the resource so that 100% of it is allocated, Pacific Corp, we have the option to recommend early closure or consolidation of certain plants and units to come up with a similar type of allocation of coal resources for consideration for each of the commission in those states. And so it does potentially have a little bit of a iterative process behind it, which is why we asked for 4 years to work through this.
Mike, are you going to talk a little bit about what a realignment of a coal resource might mean for percentages? In other words, Utah right now is about 42% of any coal plant.
Right.
What happens if a coal plant, Oregon share, 25%, is realigned to Idaho, Wyoming, and Utah, or reassigned, I should say.
Yeah.
It would take Utah up about a third. So if it's just Oregon, you would take, you'd be going up around 14, 15%.
If it's proportional.
That's-
across
Yeah, if
the
it's
three.
proportional.
Yeah, if it's
Right,
proportional. across
If it's
all three
proportional,
states.
but that's one of the options that states have is to take that, you know, in a non-proportional way, so then it all depends
Right.
on what the state approves and what the, you know, what is negotiated.
So if it's a proportional reassignment of the coal unit, then Utah would approach what, 65%?
Yeah.
Yep. And,
And then if you factor in Washington getting out, then it would go up a couple percentage higher than that, and then, so it depends on which states get out and which states accept it.
Right. Okay, thanks.
And then just looking at those same tranches again, you know, the reassignment process is a little bit different for each of those groups of resources. So for the group of resources where we anticipate a closure, a common closure is what we've called it, where all states are exiting that coal plant and Pacific Corp would be retiring or getting out of their share. Most of these are minority owned. So for example, Cholla is, you know, we've already announced the anticipated retirement of Cholla at the end of the year, and so there's no reassignment process with that. That all states will close that down. Will seek cost recovery, the appropriate cost recovery, and the decommissioning costs of that in each state, and so there's no real special treatment for that. For Bridger, DJ, and Naughton, these are the ones that exist where Oregon would exit before 2027. So in our upcoming rate case, we will ask for exit orders from the Oregon Commission to say yes, at the end of their Oregon depreciable lives, Oregon will no longer take costs and benefits from these plants. And then we would, so we would ask for that by the end of the year or as part of a rate case order. And then a couple months later, February 1 of 21, we would kick off that reassignment process and that proceeding in Utah, Idaho, and Wyoming. For Hunter, Huntington, and Wyodak, we would expect that process to play out just 3 years later. So to have an exit order by end of 23, with the reassignment process kicking off in the other states in 24, June 30th, 24. And then, like I said, for Hayden, there's still things we need to work out with our joint owners, and so we've agreed to make a recommendation to the Framework Issues Work Group by February 1st of 21. So how that is handled would be potentially part of the post-interim method agreement. Decommissioning costs. So part of the agreement is that when states do not share a common depreciable lives and are exiting coal plants at different times, the exiting state would pay, if the exiting state would pay the best estimate we have of the decommissioning costs. And that would then transfer with the reassignment of the plant and would be offset the future decommissioning costs of that plant once it is finally decommissioned. And so we planned 2 decommissioning studies. The first one was completed on January 15th, 2020. That was filed as part of the depreciation study docket. And we had a phone call on the 17th to Chad Tepley from the company and Greg Lauder, who works for Chad. They both kind of walked through that and how that's really a more in-depth study than we've done in the past for decommissioning costs. And then Coal Strip was kind of a late add to that study. So that study looked at Jim Bridger, Dave Johnson, Hunter, Huntington, Naughton, Wyodak, and Hayden. And then Coal Strip was a late add, so that will be completed by the end of March. And then we will do a second decommissioning study for the remaining, for Hunter, Huntington, and Wyodak to be completed by June 30th of 2024. And so those will be used to inform, specifically, will be used to inform all, depreciation and decommissioning costs, but specifically for Oregon to help ensure that as they exit the coal plants and Washington, that they've paid their fair share of the decommissioning cost. And one thing with the decommissioning study is this really is the best estimate that we could get without actually providing a winning bid to do the work. And so we're trying to get much more clarity there so that states are paying their fair share. And then one thing is that states may authorize independent reviews of the decommissioning studies. So Oregon has informed me that they are going to do an independent review of the decommissioning study. And then for the joint owned plants, Oregon they will be exiting those joint owned plants at the common depreciable lives. However, there's a lot of things that we have to work through with those the other owners and the labor force and things like that. And so Oregon will pay the actual decommissioning costs as long as we are able to close that plant or terminate our interest in that plant within a year of that common depreciation date. And if it extends beyond that year, then they would exit the plant and pay their estimated decommissioning costs.
Is Oregon's independent review taking place as part of their depreciation docket, or is that sort of an independent process?
I imagine it would have to be part of the depreciation docket, but Steve Storm, who's been representing Oregon, just called me the other day and told me that they were going to do it, and we didn't have much time to talk logistics, but yeah.
It seems like it'll probably play out in the rate case.
And
Right.
it will play out in the rate case as well, yeah.
In the Oregon rate case.
Because so we filed the decommissioning study in the depreciation docket, but depreciation rates for Oregon will be updated and then flow through the revenue requirement in the rate case. So that's how it ultimately gets their rates.
But you expect that it would be, the review would sort of go as part of the depreciation docket, or you just don't know?
Yeah, and I just don't know, and I think there's a chance that the dockets get consolidated in Oregon. I know they're probably gonna be consolidated in Washington,
Okay.
so.
Do you know what their study entails? Are they going out to the market to say, what are contractors charging, or are they maybe, do you know if they're doing that versus hiring an expert who would?
So we hired Kiewit to do the decommissioning study. They did site visits, reviewed all the drawings.
What is Oregon doing?
Oh, what is Oregon? Oh, I'm sorry.
I have an idea what you guys are doing.
Okay, yeah. I don't know yet. So Steve just called me literally a couple days ago and said, "Hey, we're gonna do this. Can you send me the scope of work and a few other things that we had provided the Kiewit to do the decommissioning studies?" So it was a pretty quick conversation. So. But I think they are going to do a RFP and ask for that independent evaluator.
Okay.
I think we've covered the decommissioning costs on 15. And then moving to 16, the QF PPAs. The QF PPAs, we talked about there's the delineating time period or date of 1/1/20. If they had an existing contractor, Leo, before that, they will continue to be system allocated and there's no change, or if they were already online, obviously no change, and continue to be system allocated as they are today under the 2017 protocol. For new QFs, that will be
Until 2029.
until 2029, that's right.
And then they will be
Yes. So,
stayed aside.
thank you, Gary. So, and then for those existing QFs, there's two things that, once 2029, 12/31/29 is a flash cut, any QFs that are system assigned at that point will switch over to a situs assignment, and that's part of the resolved issues that we've talked about. And then if a QF renews as well, so if their current contract expires and then renews, it is considered a new contract and will move to a situs assignment. So that's even before 29. So if it's existing today, expires before 29 and is renewed, it moves to the new treatment. Once we have nodal pricing in place, this will be handled through the nodal pricing model. But in the interim period, before nodal pricing is in place, we came up with what we called a reasonable energy price. And this is the QF, and the QF cost above the reasonable energy price will be situs assigned to the state that approved that QF. And then the reasonable energy price, it's determined by the weighted average of the market prices used to set the QF. So we take the price curve that was used in setting that QF price, and we have a weighted average, and that we use that for the reasonable energy price, and that is still the system energy that is allocated to the entire system. Like I said, anything above that is the responsibility of the state that approved that resource.
Excuse me, on this reasonable energy price, does that have to be approved by any commission, or is that just, there's a formula for it and that's how you would do it? Or?
Yeah, there's a formula for it, and that's how we do it. So the commission sets the QF price, and then included in that QF price is energy and capacity, and every state is a little bit different, and how those are calculated and the methodologies used. So the group determined that we would come up with this formulaic approach using the price curve, and we did a couple grid runs with and without a 100 megawatt resource at different locations on our system, and determined the mix of the change in our wholesale transactions at the different market hubs, and that's how we weighted the different market hubs. So that weighting is set. So that's firm in the agreement, so that doesn't change. But what does change is the price curve that we use. So that we just use the official forward price curve that the company publishes every quarter, and we apply those prices to that price curve, or that weighting to the price curve, sorry. And then moving on to slide.
Maybe, the idea in the 2017 protocol, and even in some of the earlier protocols, there was just a short paragraph on QFs that said anything above what the company would have paid is situs assigned to the state that approves the contract. And discussions in the MSP, nobody's ever challenged.
Yeah, it has to be
Right,
challenged.
yeah, so that only applied if it was challenged.
Yeah.
Right, and so, but the discussion around it is that there was really it's pretty ambiguous.
Yep.
Very ambiguous.
And so this is really the same concept, it's just putting a little bit more concrete information in there on how it would be determined.
And then, thanks Hardy, that's good. Good comment. So moving on to slide 17. The one other adjustment that we've made in the 2020 protocol regarding QFs is the Wyoming adjustment. So Wyoming QF prices have been significantly lower than the average QF prices across our system. And because of that, Pacific Corp agreed to adjust the costs allocated to Washington during the interim period by $5 million per year, so it'd be a reduction to Wyoming's revenue requirement. And then from 23 to 29, if we reach agreement for a post-interim method, by $7.175 million each year. And those adjustments will flow through their ECAM, similar to the EBA in Utah. And this, important to note that this adjustment does not impact the revenue requirement of any of our other states. This is a, Pacific Corp absorbs this adjustment in Wyoming. So that is the 2020 protocol. That's the big changes to the 2020 protocol, what are implemented right now during the interim period. So now we're moving into the post-interim period and what that agreement looks like and what and the things that we need to resolve there. But so we've gone through that first tranche, the implemented issues. So those things that we've talked about thus far are all effective 1/1/20 and upon approval of the state commissions as part of the new 2020 protocol. And now these resolved issues, these are specifically for that post-interim period method that it still has to be completely resolved. These resolved issues will be implemented pending the framework issues being resolved. But these are things that parties have agreed to that will change and need to change. The first one is the allocation of generation costs. Existing generation resources, so services that are in service, resources that are in service by the end of the interim period, those are what we call the existing generation resources, and those will be assigned to states based on a 4-year average.
I'll put my glasses on, but does that say existing or exiting?
It does say exiting. Yeah. Man, nobody in Wyoming caught that.
Nobody in Wyoming and none of us that read.
Yeah, none of us multiple
times have caught it.
Yeah.
Well, what is it supposed to say?
Existing.
Existing.
Yeah. Just say existing resources. So these are resources that are in service by the end of the interim period. So that time when the 2020 protocol is in effect. And these costs, starting at the end of the interim period, so that post-interim period method, they will be assigned to states based on the 4-year average of the SG factor, the system generation factor. And those will be fixed going forward. So we'll take a 4-year average and that will be the allocation. So the dynamic allocation factors for generation will end and it'll be fixed going forward. Fixed assignment of new resources. So shares of new resources, both the costs and benefits, those will be assigned as opposed to system allocated to states. The assignment process is something that's needed to be resolved in the framework issues from a resource planning standpoint and a new resource assignment, and we'll talk more about that. But really what we've agreed to is that going forward, generation will be fixed allocation factors. And that really goes back to the concept of states diverging from a common generation portfolio to having a unique generation portfolio and needing to fix those factors since they'll no longer be able to be dynamically allocated. And yeah.
You said that you get the costs and the benefits. Is the benefits more than just the energy, or will it get benefits for, supporting the system, or?
So some of that is still to be determined, but the benefits definitely include the energy, any environmental attributes. So this is all generation, it's not just thermal generation. So if Utah is assigned a fixed percentage of a wind facility, 45% fixed, then 45% of the RECs are assigned to Utah, 45% of the PTCs are assigned to Utah. And so any benefits that go along with that.
It's certainly the intent that other benefits too.
Yes.
Yes.
um, Ancillary services, that sort of thing
Yeah.
be determined. That still to be worked out, how we value that
Right,
in the
yeah.
whole marketplace.
And
But
both for benefits and costs.
Right.
Yeah, and that's a good point. The intent is yes. How we value that and how we determine some of those other things like ancillary benefits is something that needs to be worked out. Transmission costs. Transmission costs will be allocated based on a new ST factor, which is essentially the same as the SG factors calculated today, but that will change to the ST factor, system transmission factor. So that is determined by a weighting of 75% demand based on 12-month coincident peak and 25% energy. And then
You have your loads for factors include special contract loads, but there's an asterisk there
yeah,
that says to be determined.
To be
Because the
determined.
the special contract issues aren't resolved.
that's correct, Gary. That is a framework issue as well. And then moving on, slide 20. The system overhead cost, those will continue to be allocated on a SO factor. However, the SO factor, the calculation of that will change a little bit. And it'll be a 1/3 weighting of system capacity, system energy, and that's gross plant, you gotta remind me.
Gross plant distribution.
Gross plant distribution, right?
Which approximates what it is now, but that way as people do generation decisions, you aren't impacting your overhead allocations, they're more fixed.
Other costs that are, have been resolved and the allocation of those include, the distribution costs, in the post-interim period, those will continue to be cited and allocated to the states where they're located or to the states they serve. Demand side management costs, the cost of DSM programs, those will remain cited to the states. And then state-specific resources, we have a few of those now, but any state-specific resources, those will remain CITES. And then all other costs, typically, those will remain the same as under the 2017 protocol. However, the new fixed factor that we talked about for generation, that is called the AP factor. So if the cost can be identified as related to a particular generation resource, that cost will follow the fixed AP factor. And then the same for any costs that are related to the system, that can be related to transmission resources, those will be allocated to based on the transmission factor. And so again, those are the resolved issues. Those only go into effect if we come to an agreement and resolution of the framework issues. And so moving on to slide 22.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Just on your load-based dynamic factors, the loads now are, so they're just weather normalized loads, or the only adjustments to the load, to the dynamic allocation? Is that what it is now?
No,
There's weather normalization?
there's certain other adjustments. For instance, we normalize the interruptible contracts like the Utah programs, the irrigation and the load control.
So that's still included in the,
That's included in the
Calculation
interim
of
period, yes, but for
SC.
transmission, we actually use the transmission load. So-
Okay.
So that will change.
Okay, so moving to the framework issues. So So these are the really the meat of what we'll be doing over the next couple years. And this is what we have to work through and come to a resolution on in order for those resolved issues to take effect. And we've got a subgroup of the MSP group. So the MSP process is still an open process, but there's a subgroup for negotiations on the framework issues that are the framework issues work group. And that's the signatories to the 2020 protocol that have agreed to the framework and the process and the resolved issues that will continue to negotiate these framework issues over the next couple years. But realizing that there are some pressing needs to resolve some of these things as far as decisions that will be made on reassignment or that we'll be asking to be made on reassignment. So these are pressing issues that we'll be working on. So the first framework issue is on slide 22 now is the resource planning and new resource assignment. So this goes back to that first principle that I talked about is maintain system planning while meeting individual state resource portfolio requirements. So PacifiCorp believes, and we think it's reasonable to expect that there is a benefit to planning as a system, that the diversity in the geographical diversity and the diversity in peak loads benefit all of our customers across all of our states, and we want to maintain that as much as possible while allowing each state the flexibility to choose its own resource portfolio, or at least to comply with the standards that it has, whether that's Washington wanting to be carbon neutral in 2030, or being out of coal by a date certain, or wanting to continue to operate coal in Wyoming, or cities in Utah having their energy goals and energy policies. So as we move to these unique resource portfolios, we want to maintain that system benefit as much as we can. Again, it's a framework issue, so something that's to be determined exactly how we do that, but that's what we will be working on. The second one is our net power cost.
Just a minute.
Sorry.
Would you need to come to each commission then to get the changes to the integrated resource planning approved? Is that part of the plan?
I don't know. I think it depends on what exactly what that IRP looks like. So
If there's a change that's required from the current rules or guidelines from a state.
So you do an evaluation of that while you're figuring this out?
Yes,
So-
yeah.
okay.
I'm sure the parties will help us figure that out.
Right, yeah. The second one is net power costs and the nodal pricing model. This was a significant portion of my testimony in the 2020 protocol. We spent a lot of time talking about net power costs and the nodal pricing, and using kind of conceptually we used what we learned in EIM and locational marginal pricing and how that works to really extend that to a PacifiCorp only. How would we fairly track the energy and the net power cost by state, but still maintain the same concept, still maintain the benefit of dispatching as a system and that economic dispatch of PacifiCorp's system, and we came up with the nodal pricing model. And parties have agreed and signed the nodal pricing MOU for PacifiCorp to acquire and implement a nodal pricing model. So we've been working with CAISO. They are going to be our third-party dispatch engine, or they will run the nodal pricing model for us. And so essentially what that means is that using their day-ahead market model, They will take Pacific Corp's information that we provide them, and they will give us a optimized dispatch for the next day, the day ahead, and along with the LMP prices. And we will use that to, along with the EIM settlements, to track the net power cost by state. So the expected implementation timeline it says for dispatch, but really it's for day-ahead schedules, beginning in January of 21. It's probably more mid-January, January 15th, just with the holidays, and Kaisa wanted a couple weeks to implement that. And then after and that will give us, experience, give us time to evaluate what nodal pricing looks like, because right now it's a concept, but this will help us do that. So the first place you'll see nodal pricing is in the rate case. There's some cost associated with nodal pricing, and then in order to forecast a nodal dispatch, we will need to update our grid model, and so we are also working with the Energy Exemplar folks on building the Aurora model to be able to have that nodal dispatch for our net power cost forecast. But then one other important thing just to note is that nodal pricing would not be used for allocation purposes until the post-interim period. As Gary noted earlier, special contracts with large industrial customers, that's still how those are handled in the cost allocations, and their impact on loads and the costs and benefits of those contracts. Those are still an open item and something that the Framework Issues Work Group needs to work through, and the company, as part of the 2020 protocol, has committed to providing a proposal to that group by September 1 of 21. So a little over a year. And we've mentioned limited realignment a little bit, and so Washington is a little unique in that they have to be out of coal-fueled resources by the end of 2025 is their law, the Clean Energy and Transportation Act, which we refer to as CETA. The Washington has historically and continues under the YJAM method only been allocated shares of the coal plants and the gas plants in the Pacific Corp West Balancing Area Authority. So that's the Colstrip coal plant and the Jim Bridger coal plant and the Chehalis gas plant and the Hermiston gas plant. So one thing that we've discussed, but we need to further discuss and negotiate, is that for Washington, the way that we propose to facilitate Washington's exit from coal is a little bit different than Oregon's, and that would be a limited realignment where we would realign Washington's share of the existing coal plants to the remaining states and the RMP states, and that we would move Chehalis to a situs assigned asset or resource for Washington. So that's a gas-fired plant in Washington, and that it makes a lot of sense for a lot of policy decisions. If Washington wants to tax the emissions of Chehalis, then it would only impact Washington customers if they want to close it down and replace it with something else that would just impact Washington customers. So that would the trade-off that we would negotiate around and look at during the framework issues over the next couple of years. This next one is a straw proposal to recover post-interim period capital additions to coal-fueled generation resources. So There are certain generation resources that Oregon will be, like we discussed, would be exiting from earlier before the end of its operating life. However, we still need to maintain those coal plants, and that may require some capital additions. So for any capital additions that are made for the purpose of for the sole purpose of extending lives and beyond the exit dates or following a catastrophic failure, those are allocated to the states based on the AP factors of the states without exit orders. So a state with an exit order will not pay for a capital addition that's purposes to extend its life. And this includes any environmental upgrades that would be put on a coal plant to extend its life. The capital additions made from 2024 to the exit dates that are through 27. For states with exit orders, the additions are allocated to states based on their AP factor, that new fixed factor, and then prorated for the years to the exit date and the years to the end of the longest depreciable lives. So we have a little bit of an example here. So if a capital addition, for example, was made in 2024 and the unit had an exit date of 2025, but its longest depreciable life was 2037, so the RMP states had 2037 depreciable lives, they would pay 14.3%. So you would see you take 2025 minus 2024 plus 1, and then that's the remaining time that state would be in that plant, and they would so they would pay 2/15, or because the 15 years is the amount of time left on that resource.
The denominator, shouldn't that be 14? Based on the numbers? I'm just.
Oh man. Yeah.
Yeah, we'll need to put it into Excel to verify.
Illustrative purposes.
When we get into the big numbers, I have troubles, and I was just wondering if.
We're the opposite. We have trouble on the small numbers.
Okay.
No, yeah, you're right.
That seems to.
Without subject to check.
We'll agree to that.
Okay.
Again,
I mean, this is just.
Nobody saw this.
Normally Lee is so good at picking apart things.
I know.
I mean, this is just an illustration, right?
Yes.
Okay.
So essentially, we're saying if you have an exit order, you pay a prorated share of that depreciation for that asset. And then, so capital additions made for coal-fueled resources with exit dates after 27. So for 24 and 25, additions are allocated to all states based on their respective AP factors. And then after 26, the treatment that above kicks in. And so again, this is a framework issue, so it's definitely a little bit more baked than some of the other things like resource planning and new resource assignment, but it's still a framework issue that needs to be worked through. It probably is the framework issue that we worked the most on, and the one that's probably most likely to be resolved first. Oregon parties, they wanted this to be a framework. They asked kind of the last towards the end of negotiations to move this to framework issues. They wanted their commission to see this and kind of give it as long as they didn't give it a complete thumbs down, this is something that Oregon parties said that they they thought was a good compromise. So so just wanted to give everyone a heads up that in Oregon, if you see in an order on the 2020 protocol, some language, around this specific framework issue, that's why, is because staff kind of asked for more guidance on this and wanted some direction as to whether this would be an acceptable approach to the Oregon Commission or not. In all the other states, I would expect, I wouldn't expect that same type of language. I mean, obviously, commissions are free to opine on any of this, but just want to give folks a heads up of why they might see language in an Oregon order specifically about this framework issue. And so, like I said, that could be the first one to be resolved as we work through the framework issues, or one of the first things to be resolved, because if obviously there's still some things to work through, but it is further along than the rest of them. So just a couple of other items in the 2020 protocol. Any allocation to states for the gain or loss of sales. So sorry, I'm on slide 25 now. For the loss of sales of generation assets will be based on the AP factors, so that new fixed factor. And if the sale occurs within 12 months of a reassignment of the resource, then that gain or loss will be allocated based on what states were assigned prior to the reassignment. So there's kind of a 12-month window there. So, and then talked a little bit about the governance issues. So, like I said, we established a framework issue work group to achieve resolution of those framework issues, and that is open to all signatories of the 2020 protocol and will be considered confidential settlement negotiations. The MSP work group will remain and may convene when issues arise regarding the 2020 protocol or just cost allocations in general. We are no longer requiring a commission forum on a regular basis, but it can be requested as needed. And there is an interdependency of approvals by all commissions in 6 states without material alteration. So if there is a material alteration by any one state, then that would open the 2020 protocol to continue negotiations. The compliance with the resource law, Pacific Corp asserts that we believe that the 2020 protocol complies with the requirements of the current laws in all 6 states. So next steps, we filed the 2020 protocol December 3rd, so on slide 26 now. We talked about the equalization adjustment ended on 1/1/20. That was the effective date of the new protocol, but of course we're pending approval in all states. Any new PPAs that are signed and executed would now be citus and subject to the treatment that we discussed.
Is it the reasonable energy price, is that like available today, or is it what?
Yeah, so we published our quarterly price curve, and then the weighting of the market prices is in the 2020 protocol. So there's a chart that shows the weighting of the prices. The decommissioning studies, we've talked about those. Those were provided in supplemental filings to the depreciation study cases on the January 16th, and we held a conference call with parties on the 17th to kind of review the study at a high level. We'll take a much deeper dive in both the upcoming all-state depreciation meeting and in the MSP meeting in March. Colstrip will supplement that decommissioning study with Colstrip in March, and then by the end of the year, we're expected to have our first set of exit orders from Oregon as part of the order for our rate case. So when we file in February, in just a little under a month, we will ask the commission to give us exit orders for those plants. And then I will say, the exit orders, though our intent is to ask for those exit orders from Oregon as part of the rate case, the 2020 protocol does allow for exit orders to, they do not have to be part of the rate case. They could be part of another applicable regulatory proceeding. So.
Back to those QFPPAs. So when, we've got some annual PPAs that, for QFs, and so when the company files, they would provide the pricing, but also the reasonable energy price as well, so that people would know.
Yeah, we can,
I was wondering if that's the plan.
I don't know if we have.
now.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know.
That's a good response. It is now.
Something to,
Yeah.
yeah, because yeah, thank
I mean, you won't know the reasonable energy price in advance,
Right,
right? It's a look back, is it not?
No, it's
Oh, yeah,
based on the
it's
price
based on
curve.
your forward price.
Well, we don't get
That's
the
right.
forward price.
That's
curve,
right, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Itself, so.
Mhm.
I think that's, at least in Utah, always been part of the pricing model.
But I mean,
Not the whole
it would be
forward
easy
price
enough to
curve.
us to take the price curve and the weighting and, have a exhibit or work paper that showed what the reasonable energy price was for allocation purposes. And so the intent of that is not to impact the QF price at all, and the MSP agreement is not intended to impact QF pricing, and that's a very state-specific and, dealt with at each state commission. It's only intended to affect the allocation of the costs. So,
I think it's fair to say this was an agreement among non-QF developers, right? Nobody knows how the commission will choose to treat the fact that the avoided cost may be X and the
Right.
reasonable energy price may be Y, and there may be an allocation to the state.
Right.
In fact, there will be a delta if there are capacity costs in there, right, presumably. We haven't, this group didn't address how you're going to deal with that as a
Okay.
commission. And like I say, there were no QF developers in the room. I had to
But
change my hat.
the pricing of the contract will include capacity, but the
Yeah.
reasonable price is just an energy price.
No, that's my point. So, as an illustration, if a QF came in and the avoided cost was $20, and that reasonable energy price were 16, that means you're, in approving it, you're going to agree to that $4 allocation to Utah. And I'm saying, there was no real discussion or agreement about how states are gonna deal with that fact, or whether they legally can take that into consideration, or whatever. I think there are a lot of QF issues unresolved, because again, it was not a QF group.
Thank you.
So looking into 21, in January, we expect to have the nodal pricing model implemented for dispatch or for front office for them to use in their scheduling and plant commitments. Then that will, of course, help us in the framework issues group as we work through those issues. We also file approval for recommendations regarding the operations 81 and 2. And we'll also start the reassignment process for the units that Oregon is to exit by 12/31/27. And then we will provide special contract, proposal for special contract customers to the framework issues work group. We've got a little bit of a break in 22, but then in 23, and this has not been updated, that Choya Unit 4 was expected to cease operations. That's obviously outdated, and that should be 12/31/20.
Yep, right, this is the date that's in the agreement, but we have
Yeah.
subsequently made the change.
And then 12/31, Oregon and Washington exit Jim Bridger Unit 1, and that aligns with the IRP that was recently filed. And then Oregon would issue exit orders in 23 for anything that it intends to exit by 12/31/29, which is its date certain that it has to exit, so that would be essentially everything.
Michael, you haven't addressed in here California expectations. Do you have any? In terms of exit orders?
Right about the time we get the next, when we get the 2024 protocol, they'll be on the 2024. I'm just. That was a joke.
So, in the proposed decision in California, in our last rate case that we filed 2 years ago, we proposed an accelerated depreciation for California to align their depreciation dates with Oregon. And they, in their proposed decision, they denied that. And so they did not accept the accelerated depreciation, but told us that we needed to come back with a plan for plant closures, and they wanted to align that depreciation date with plant closures and instead of the end-of-life depreciation for Oregon. And so I think there's more to come on that. So that's what we would expect the final order to say.
And again, you don't expect that for about 2 or 3 years? The
No.
final order from California?
No, we expect that in February 6th.
But for the next case, it would include this, yes.
That will address this, it will be in a
Yes.
So
couple
we
of years.
specifically asked, so one thing we did ask in California for them to change from their proposed decision is their proposed decision coupled what I just said with a rate case. And we asked for the ability to do that outside of a rate case. And we think that might happen. We think we have a pretty good chance of being able to do that outside of a rate case, but if they stay with their original position that it has to be part of a rate case, yeah, it's gonna be a couple of years. So then in 24, this is when, on slide 28, this is when the interim period ends, the 2020 protocol expires, and we move into what we've referred to as the post-interim period and the methodology in place. So that reasonable energy price method for QS, that ends, and any new QS will still be situs assigned, but that would be handled through nodal pricing. We would move away from the dynamic allocation factors for generation and move to fixed allocation factors. Transmission costs would continue to be based on dynamic factors, but based on the new system transmission factor. Nodal pricing would be in place. Aurora or a nodal pricing model would be implemented for rate making. So we would use that for the allocations and for forecasting our net power cost. And then we would file for approval regarding the reassignment of the last set of coal-fired plants that Oregon will exit between 2027 and 29. 25, the Craig Unit 1 is expected to cease operations. Oregon and Washington both exit from Jim Bridger. So that's the date certain for Washington is 2025, but it could be earlier based on limited realignment, which is also why we moved the depreciation date up in the YJAM for Jim Bridger to facilitate potential limited realignment. But the date certain is end of 25. Oregon also exits the Naughton units and Colstrip unit. Washington exits Colstrip unit 4. 26, Craig unit 2 is expected to cease operations. 27, Colstrip 3 and 4 are expected to cease operations. And especially with some of these joint owned plants, some of those dates can move, and we'll continue to evaluate all coal plants in the IRP process. But this is the plan right now. 27.
But not the IRP plan.
Right.
States don't conform with.
Yes, yeah. All right. Oregon, in 2027, Oregon exits the DJ plant. And then 29, Oregon would exit all remaining coal plants, the Hunter and Huntington and Wyandotte plants. And then in 1230 is a flash cut where all QFs are now situs assigned, including any holdovers that are in place today and online today. So obviously, as we get closer to 29, more QFs will either their contracts will expire and they'll renew and they'll be situs assigned, but there will be a few holdovers that have contracts extending beyond 2030, and those will remove to situs assignment. And then one other thing that's unique for Utah is we do have an agreement with Utah parties, an additional agreement regarding the reassignment process and what that reassignment process looks like. Essentially, we've agreed that it should be evaluated as a type of resource acquisition decision. We set out timelines as to for conferences and discussions with Utah parties prior to the filings, and the agreement. And I think this is an exhibit of Joelle's testimony in the 2020 protocol filing, but it also describes filing requirements that the company has agreed to, including cost and benefits analysis for anything that we are looking to reassign or proposing to be reassigned to Utah, and evaluation of what that looks like. So that's the 2020 protocol. There's a lot of information. I think the document itself is, 80 pages about, and then that's not including all the appendices. So, a lot of, like I said, there's been a lot of work that's gone into it. A lot of folks in this room participating in those discussions, in those negotiations. And we appreciate everybody's hard work and collaboration during the process. But yeah, any other questions?
I have just a couple. Back on the QF issue, that would apply to Schedule 37 and 38?
Yes.
And so 37, we don't get notification of those, so is there gonna be a process to be informed of the difference for those? Because some of those are year by year.
They'll definitely be included in the EBA.
Okay.
So.
And I think as we make filings for Schedule 37 changes, we could possibly, we haven't had this discussion, but we would expect, somebody to at least ask for what is that calculation of the reasonable cost, how would those prices be impacted in the Schedule 37, when we update Schedule 37 rates, but for illustrative purposes, that reasonable price changes.
Right, depending on the price group.
Yeah, but that, and the EBA would be where you would see that flow through rates.
And then on the last page 30, on the second bullet, it says the agreement sets out timelines for conference and discussion with Utah parties. Is this the big P who signed it, or is it any Utah party?
It's the signet.
Yeah, I think it's the big P.
Yeah.
Okay. And then the last thing, in the interim period, are there many changes to your current model that you do for results of operations? Are there gonna? No. Okay.
Yeah, during the interim period, you're gonna see.
Except for the equalization.
Yeah, those are all I consider minor changes, yes. That amount will be zeroed out, the overall methodology and the model will be the same.
One comment, Carol, for you and already a few others of us here have been around long enough. So for 30 years now, Utah's been trying to get rolled in. And if this gets approved for one brief moment, we will have been there.
Yeah.
And then it'll be gone.
3 years.
And then it'll be gone. Been a long process.
Well, are there
Lived outcome.
any other questions for anybody? Well, with that, we'll end the technical conference and thanks for everybody's participation and for the presentation. A lot of work putting this together.
Yeah, thank you.
They have a question that's not really part of this, but, the next meeting is gonna, we can only